In the early summer of 1993, the quiet suburban community of West Memphis, Arkansas, suddenly became the center of one of the most controversial criminal investigations in American history. A place that had long been defined by working-class families, small-town rhythms, and the kind of southern routine where nothing seemed to change, was about to confront a tragedy so brutal, so incomprehensible, that it would reshape the lives of everyone involved for decades. On May 5th of that year, three 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore, left their homes to play, just as they had done countless times before. But this time, they never returned. Their disappearance triggered an urgent search, one that would lead police into the murky, wooded area known as Robin Hood Hills. And within 24 hours, the worst fears of their families and their entire community were confirmed. The discovery of the boys' bodies would ignite panic, suspicion, and ultimately, hysteria. And it was in this atmosphere of fear that three local teenagers, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miscarriage Jr., would be arrested, accused, and eventually convicted for murders many still believe they never committed. But the story of the West Memphis Three is not only about a crime. It is about the collision between public fear and flawed justice. It is about how a community under pressure can turn suspicion into certainty. And it is about the dangerous power of narratives, especially when they involve the supernatural, the unexplained, and the deeply misunderstood culture of the early 1990s. Because this is a case drenched not only in tragedy, but in moral panic. A panic that swept the nation during what would later be called the Satanic Panic era, a time when alternative music, black clothing, role-playing games, and misunderstood youth became easy targets for blame. Today, more than 3 decades later, this case continues to divide experts, investigators, and the public. Some still believe the convicted teenagers were guilty. Others insist they were victims of a broken system, punished not for what they did, but for who they were. This is the story of the West Memphis Three, a chilling mystery, an emotional tragedy, and one of the most heavily debated criminal investigations of the modern era. And to understand what truly happened, we must begin at the very moment the boys disappeared and the frantic search that followed. The search for the missing boys intensified rapidly as daylight faded on May 5th, 1993. Parents, neighbors, volunteers, and police officers combed through streets, drainage ditches, and wooded areas, calling the boys' names into the growing darkness. Flashlights cut through the trees. Dogs barked. Mothers waited anxiously on porches, hoping for any sign, any sound that might mean the boys were safe. But hours passed, and nothing. Early the next morning, the search resumed. The wooded area known locally as Robin Hood Hills, thick, muddy, and difficult to navigate, became a primary focus. It was here, near a drainage ditch, that search and rescue worker Steve Jones noticed something off. A floating sneaker, small, mud-stained, and unmistakably belonging to a child. Moments later, the nightmare fully unfolded. Under the murky water, the bodies of the 3 boys were discovered, bound, unclothed, and injured. The scene was chaotic, heartbreaking, and overwhelming for everyone present. Parents collapsed. Officers froze. Even seasoned investigators struggled to process what they were seeing. But there was something else, something investigators found deeply troubling. The crime scene was strangely devoid of the physical evidence one might expect. Little blood, few traces of a struggle, and the location itself appeared staged, as if the boys had been killed elsewhere and later placed into the drainage ditch. Despite these inconsistencies, the discovery of the bodies triggered an immediate hunt for any possible suspect. And in a town already fueled by fear, the narrative that would soon take over the investigation had already begun to form. As the sun set on West Memphis once again, rumors spread quickly. Whispers of ritualistic elements, talk of cult-like behavior, and speculation that the boys' injuries suggested more than just violence. They suggested symbolism. This narrative, whether grounded in evidence or not, would soon guide the investigation down a path that many argue was predetermined long before any facts were truly understood. The investigation into the murders began under immense pressure. Parents demanded answers. The media hovered over every development, and West Memphis law enforcement, already stretched thin, struggled to control both the case and the narrative surrounding it. Almost immediately, the police began to focus on one angle: the possibility of a ritualistic, occult-related crime. This theory didn't emerge from physical evidence. It emerged from fear. And in 1993, fear of satanic practices was not just common, it was widespread across the United States. Newspapers, talk shows, and law enforcement seminars warned of hidden cults, ritual sacrifices, and dark youth movements. The Satanic Panic had taken hold, and West Memphis became its next target. But instead of dozens of suspects, the investigation quickly narrowed to just 3 teenagers. Teenagers who dressed in black. Teenagers who listened to metal music. Teenagers who wrote dark poetry and read books that many in West Memphis considered dangerous. Their names were Damian Eccles, 18, seen by locals as strange or dark; Jason Baldwin, 16, quiet, artistic, and loyal to Damian as his closest friend; Jesse Miscarriage Jr., 17, with an IQ of around 70, easily influenced and vulnerable to suggestion. Within 2 weeks, the focus of the investigation had shifted almost entirely to them. And then, the confession happened. A confession that would not only change the lives of all 3 boys, but would anchor the entire case, despite being riddled with inconsistencies. Under hours of interrogation, Jesse Miscarriage made statements police interpreted as a confession. But the details were wrong. The timeline was wrong. Even the manner of the murders, as he described them, did not match the autopsy reports. Yet the confession, however flawed, became the foundation of the prosecution's case. And from that moment on, the real investigation stopped. The detectives had their story, they had their suspects, and they had a terrified community ready to believe that evil, literal, supernatural evil, had invaded their town. The momentum was unstoppable. The trials of the West Memphis Three began under a storm of public outrage. Local opinion had already been shaped by media headlines, rumors, and the confession that prosecutors treated as undeniable truth, despite its contradictions. Damian and Jason were tried together. Jesse was tried separately. In both trials, the prosecution presented not evidence, but symbolism: black clothing, heavy metal albums, poetry, books on Wicca and mythology. To many in the courtroom, these items were frightening. To the prosecutors, they were tools, used to convince the jury that Damian Eccles was not just a troubled teen, but the leader of a satanic cult. The defense team struggled. They lacked resources, they lacked expert witnesses, and they lacked a community willing to consider an alternative narrative. When the verdicts came in, the courtroom erupted. Damian Eccles, sentenced to death; Jason Baldwin, sentenced to life in prison; Jesse Miscarriage, sentenced to life plus 40 years. Yet even after the trials ended, many felt the truth had not been uncovered. Journalists, legal experts, and documentarians began to investigate the case independently. Their findings, including DNA evidence not matching any of the 3 teens, created a growing movement demanding justice. And then, nearly 2 decades later, something extraordinary happened. The Alford plea, a legal mechanism allowing the West Memphis Three to assert their innocence, while still accepting a guilty plea in exchange for release. On August 19, 2011, after 18 years behind bars, the West Memphis Three walked out of prison as free men, though not fully exonerated. Their lives had been changed forever. Their convictions still technically stood, but the world had finally recognized what many had believed all along: that justice had not been served. To this day, the murders of Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore remain unsolved. And while the West Memphis Three have been released, their convictions still exist, a reminder of the decades-long failure that defined this case. The real killer has never been identified. The evidence remains contradictory, incomplete, and in some cases, missing. Some investigators now point to alternative suspects. Others argue the case was mishandled from the start. And many insist that until full exoneration is granted, the truth will remain buried beneath years of fear, mistakes, and moral panic. The West Memphis Three did not just become symbols of injustice, they became a warning of how easily fear can become fact, a warning of how quickly a community can turn suspicion into guilt, and a warning of what can happen when a justice system loses its way. But the story isn't finished. As new evidence emerges and public pressure grows, many believe the case may one day be reopened.
And if that day comes, perhaps the truth, long buried beneath darkness, will finally be revealed.